Um, for tonight, I wanted to talk about, well, I titled this, What Story Are We Telling? And what it's born of is, I didn't expect, though perhaps I should have, that on my lecture last week on preparation, there was, I definitely struck a chord when talking about directors and how most of them are mediocre. And somebody asked, what's a great director? And I think I gave a decent answer, but I didn't give the best answer. And I think I have a better answer tonight. I will at some point maybe lecture on directors. I want to be careful. I don't want to put on record some of my thoughts. But yeah, so this was sort of born of that. And when I was in Santa Cruz in 2008, I worked with Tim O'Sell, who is one of the great directors I have worked with. And I played a small part in All's Well That Ends Well. And I was struck that throughout the rehearsal process, he constantly and continuously would when he was working with us, would say, "What story are we telling?" And he'd stop us, and we'd be going over text, and we'd be going over a scene. And he would continually come back to, "What story are we telling?" And I know that that sounds really simple, but it gets lost in, I think, a lot of the work actors and directors do, especially in classical theater, when everybody seems to have an opinion about how to make it better and how to reinterpret it and this, that, and the other. So I wanted to discuss some of this further. This is going to have some relation to my lecture on argument when talking about looking at a piece of text, especially a piece of text heavy with poetry and continually coming back to the question of what is the argument? What is the argument? What am I fighting for? And this is sort of a larger overarching thing. And I think a lot of what I'll talk about, it does lay more in the hands of directors, but I want to encourage you to be empowered as actors to take these questions into your hands. You may not always have a director willing to listen to you, but they will clue you into some of the questions I hope you are asking. Because in the end, what is the story really should be our core question. And I think in many productions, it entirely gets lost. So I would encourage you that this question is the bedrock of a lot of your work, is to continuously be asking, what is the story? This is both interpretive and it is analytic. I'm going to discuss its shape in both. I'll also say that this is the kind of lecture that might jump out as obvious to some of you. And some of what I'm going to talk about maybe is obvious in a sort of Theater 101 sense, but I also think it's the kind of obvious thing we lose sight of. And so it's important to come back to, and it's something as an actor and a director I return to consistently, or I try to. And I often find when I run into trouble, both as an actor and as a director, it's often because I haven't paid enough attention to this very basic question of what story am I telling? What story are we telling? And it's the responsibility of everybody in the room. Now, it's the director's job to lead this. It's the director's job to unify the room with a collective vision. That's a great director. Somebody that can unify a room with a collective vision. There's a difference between a director that says, here's the setting, we're in Victorian England, and everybody sort of says, okay, and you get your costumes, come tech, and nobody really knows why it's there, and who really cares, and it doesn't hurt you, but it doesn't help you either, and you don't really know why you're in Victorian England. I'm not saying Victorian England's a bad setting, but it's mediocre in my description of it, at least right now. It's mediocre for everybody to just sort of shrug and say, okay, well, those are the decisions. So it's the responsibility of all of us. And if a director is making certain decisions, it is his or her job to unify the room with his or her collective vision. And it's your job as an artist to step up to that vision, or if they're failing, to be able to try to fill in the cracks. And again, as I talked about last week, that's not always possible. Some roles, I do think you're doomed if you have a bad director. One consistent question, it's almost become a cliche for actors to say, what's my motivation? And it is, it is a sort of silly cliche. It's also not a bad question. It taps into sort of the bedrock of a lot of method acting, which is, you can call it objective. Some people call it action. It's always about what do you want. And it is a good basic source for looking at the structure of a scene. What do I want? What are my obstacles and how am I going to get it? You know, those are your sort of three building blocks. But when asking the question, what is the story? We're actually going sort of one level further down foundationally from what's my motivation. How can you know your motivation if you don't understand the story? And how can you understand, and again, this is both analytic and interpretive. I say it's interpretive in that, what does Hamlet want when he comes on to say to be or not to be? The script does not tell us. And people argue over it all the time. It's your job as an artist to make a decision about what Hamlet wants when he walks onto the stage to say to be or not to be. And it's hopefully your director's job to help you with that. But that is interpretive. However, there's also analytic. You know, there's the Slings and Arrows, wonderful show. If you haven't watched it, I encourage you to. There is, in season 3, the actress playing Goneril insists that Goneril would never kill herself. And this is not interpretive. The script tells us that she kills herself. So that is your ego, or whatever it is, getting in your way. The analytical part of asking what is the story is asking, what is the script giving me? What are the facts? What is non-negotiable? The interpretive part of what is the story is what questions hasn't the script answered that I have to answer, either as an actor or, in a much larger sense, as a director. And so, and analytical and interpretive do overlap at times, but I would urge you to think of, when you ask what's the story, the analytical are the things that are not debatable. The script has given them to you. So unless you're doing a reconstruction or a deconstruction, unless you're actively choosing to fuck with the base material, these points aren't negotiable. And the interpretive are all the holes you have to fill in, because Shakespeare was much more interested in questions than he was in answers. And I think part of his greatness and part of why these plays survive is that he didn't answer the question of Isabella, or the question of Helena or Bertram, or the question of Antonio and Sir Andrew at the end of Twelfth Night. And he doesn't answer the question of, is Henry V a jingoistic warmonger, or is he a national hero? And he doesn't answer the question of, did Petruchio brainwash Kate? And he doesn't, he's much more interested in the questions. And I urge you to be, when you say, what is the question of the play, or what is the story of the play? I think most often the answer will be a question. And so in asking what the story is, you should be asking it of every scene, of every act, of every arc, and of every play. Now, again, this sounds obvious. This sounds like the most basic thing. I know a lot of actors that don't do it. They sort of study their lines. They do some of the things. They read in the Riverside a bit. They get some idea of the play. But the point is that it's shallow. Too many actors are shallow. And I urge you not to be shallow. So, what is the story? On the point of analysis, it's understanding as deeply as you can the work. That is, in Shakespeare, that means both literally what the words mean, what the confusing places are, but it's also about being a detective and digging deeper. You know, it's a bit of a, it's not a, you'll hear a lot of teachers talk about the fact that the reason we keep coming back to Shakespeare or Chekhov or Ibsen, we come back to the great playwrights because the more we give them, the more they return to us. You will, you know, Bottom's speech is a good metaphor for the entire works of Shakespeare. It hath no bottom. You won't reach its base. You will never dig deep enough. So if you ever reach a point working on Shakespeare that you think you've got it figured out, I would suggest you're being shallow. I would suggest that you haven't continued to ask the questions of the whys and the hows and the what's this for that build the deeper productions. I also think that's why resident companies, which don't really exist in the United States, are generally better. because these actors and directors have spent years working on this kind of work together. And so a shorthand gets developed. So I urge you to be a detective, not to be shallow, to dig deeper. And as a sort of bridge to interpretation, I think a great artist is beyond anything else a great interpreter. And that the height of your work is the height of interpretation of a part or play. So to the answer I wish I could have given last week, I think the great directors will surround you with great interpretations. The great directors will think more deeply about the play than you have. They will think more deeply about the characters than you have. And they will surround you with costumes, sets, cuttings, stagings that continually lift the elevation of your interpretation of the play. And Tim O'Sell, Scott Wentworth, I've had the honor of working with a few truly great directors. And that is what they're constantly doing. Always returning to the story, always surrounding you with interpretation. And these interpretations are surprising, they're creative, they're new, but they're rooted in the play. They're not surprising, creative, or new for their own sake. Now, you could say there's nothing new under the sun. That's probably true. But theater is ephemeral. And even if a production is videotaped, seeing a videotape production will never give you the true feeling of sitting in a theater with a great artist's interpretation. So even if they're stealing, great artists steal. You know, that's Picasso, right? So I steal all the time. I watch all the performances I can. Anything I can steal. If I think it heightens truth, if I think it heightens the interpretation, I'm happy to do it. I encourage you to do it. You know, the only chance to get caught stealing is if you steal too soon or too obviously. Be delicate. That's part of interpretation. So as far as that goes for you, well, actually, and this is also about productions, you know, the great directors are not always literal. We've talked about Shakespeare and myth. We've talked about the horizontal and the vertical, to the gods and to the people, to the hells. He's working at levels that sort of modern or naturalistic or realistic dramas aren't working on. I encourage you to embrace that. I like to believe, you know, there's evidence that Hermione has actually been hidden for all of Winter's Tale. I like to believe she just comes back to life. Thaisa was dead and then she wasn't. I mean, his late plays are all about rebirth. They're all about myth and miracles. I think embracing that is a healthy thing and embracing his work. And it's one of my favorite things as a director is to attempt to surround my artists with, my ambition is for great interpretation, but I'm not concerned with the literal. I'm not concerned with it. And to an extent, I would encourage you as actors not to be either. That has to do with the performance in terms of not getting distracted by the wrong questions. You know, in Lear, for example, I think it's a good question to say, why are there no mothers? And what has it done to a world that there is no feminine force of power? I don't know how helpful it is to spend a great deal of time, especially in rehearsal, talking to your director about what Goneril's mother was like. And I'm not saying you as an actor can't spend a little time considering that yourself. That's about your work and whatever works for you. But rehearsal time is valuable. And I encourage you not to get hung up on the wrong questions. And really asking what Goneril's mother was like. What story are we telling? Does answering this question help us tell a better story? If you in your private work need it, do it. But I'm often talking about the work in the rehearsal room. I also ask you not to get hung up on the wrong problems. So always asking yourself, what is the story? Letting that lead you to the argument, letting that lead you to the problems to address with a director or as a director, and the real questions that you want to answer and you want to heighten. always asking what is the story, and always asking what is the best way to tell it. So that is, I think, bedrock to your work. It sounds obvious. It is obvious. It often gets lost. And I think it will benefit you as artists never to lose sight of that question, and to remember that it's both an analytic question. It's about going to the text and understanding the facts of it as deeply as possible. And it's an interpretive question, which is going to the questions of the text, which are often much bigger and harder to answer, and striving with your artistic vision and your artistic choices to answer those through your performance and through your ensemble work in the play. So that's it. What is the story? And how are we telling it? Never lose sight of it. And the great directors surround you with great interpretation. That's it. Simple one. Happy to take questions if anyone has any. Just throw your hands up in the chat. All right. I haven't done this yet, this class. I think we're good. No questions? Will?